Jamie Raskin called Speaker Johnson a constitutional illiterate, hiding behind a Bible on live television. Then Johnson recited the entire article, one from memory, and Raskin's face went white. But that's nothing compared to what happened when Johnson opened his briefcase full of destroyed evidence by minute 47. Raskin's own lawyer abandoned him on camera, saying, "I cannot represent someone actively obstructing justice. You won't believe which Democrat stood up and said, 'I can't defend this constitutional vandalism anymore.'" The Bible carrying Speaker's biblical justice is the most devastating political exposure ever recorded. Speaker Johnson, with all due respect, your understanding of constitutional law is pedestrian. Perhaps if you spent less time with your Bible and more time with actual legal scholarship, you'd understand the complexities of congressional oversight. Jamie Raskin's Maryland condescension filled the House committee hearing room. The former January 6th committee member sat behind a table flanked by 5 attorneys, surrounded by media eager to watch him lecture the soft-spoken Louisiana lawyer who'd somehow become Speaker of the House. Mike Johnson looked up from his single notebook, his expression unchanged when he spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried perfectly through the chamber. "Professor Raskin, I appreciate your concern for my education. Perhaps I should clarify my credentials. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Section 2. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every 2nd year by the people of the several states." Johnson continued reciting word perfect through all 10 sections of Article 1. The chamber went silent. Raskin's smirk faded. 3 minutes of flawless constitutional recitation ended with Section 10's restrictions on state powers. "That's from memory, Professor," Johnson said softly. "Now, shall we discuss your January 6th committee's constitutional violations? Because I've been doing some reading, too." He opened his briefcase and pulled out 8 manila folders, each labeled in clear block letters. Destroyed evidence, witness tampering, hidden exculpatory material, media coordination, family enrichment scheme, constitutional violations, cover-up conspiracy, criminal referrals. 23 hard drives destroyed, Johnson continued calmly. 847 witness transcripts lost. 17 witnesses who recanted their testimony after your committee dissolved. $4.7 million in book deals during your investigation. Your son's nonprofit that kept 92% of $23 million raised for January 6th victims. And that's just the first 3 folders. Raskin's lead attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. The color had drained from Raskin's face. "But don't worry," Professor Johnson said, his voice carrying that same soft Louisiana calm. "We're going to examine every single page, every destroyed file, every coached witness, every constitutional principle you violated. Because unlike your committee, we believe in due process, transparency, and equal justice under law." He glanced at his Bible sitting next to the folders, then back at Raskin. Proverbs 26:27 says, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it." Professor Raskin, you spent 2 years digging. Today, we see how deep the hole goes. The House Select Committee on January 6th, Committee Accountability, was now in session, and Jamie Raskin was about to learn that constitutional illiteracy and biblical faith are not the same thing. The contrast couldn't be more deliberate. Jaime Raskin had arrived at the Rayburn House office building like a general returning from victorious campaign. His entourage included 5 lawyers from elite firms, 3 communications consultants, and 7 staffers carrying bankers' boxes filled with prepared statements, legal briefs, and media talking points. He wore a tailored Navy suit that cost more than most Americans earned in a month. His signature purple pocket square, precisely folded. The media section was packed with friendly faces from MSNBC, CNN, and various progressive outlets who'd faithfully amplified every January 6th committee leak for 2 years. Mike Johnson arrived alone. The Speaker of the House carried one weathered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived decades of Louisiana humidity, a pocket-sized Constitution with dog-eared pages, and a Bible whose spine was cracked from regular reading. His suit was conservative and unremarkable, the kind you'd find at any mid-range department store. No entourage, no media handlers, no boxes of prepared spin. The hearing room itself reflected the stakes. Every seat was filled with overflow crowds watching from hallways on closed-circuit screens. The Democrat side of the committee looked confident, even bored. They'd spent 2 years watching Raskin perform, watching him command national attention, watching him position himself as the constitutional scholar defending democracy. This oversight hearing was supposed to be a formality, a chance for Raskin to defend his committee's work, and perhaps embarrass the new Republican Speaker in the process. The Republican side was quieter, more focused. They'd spent months waiting for this moment, watching Johnson methodically build his case with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. No leaks, no grandstanding, just patient, deliberate preparation. As the hearing gave to order, Raskin immediately seized the microphone for his opening statement. His voice carried the practiced cadence of a law professor who loved hearing himself think out loud. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, American people watching at home. Today, we see yet another attempt to rewrite history, to whitewash the violent insurrection that threatened our democracy, to attack those of us who had the courage to investigate and expose the truth about January 6th. He warmed to his theme, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. Speaker Johnson and his colleagues would have you believe that documenting an attempted coup was somehow improper, that preserving democracy requires apologizing to those who tried to destroy it, that constitutional scholarship means ignoring constitutional crimes. Raskin turned to look directly at Johnson, his expression mixing pity with condescension. Speaker Johnson, I've reviewed your legal background. Alliance, defending freedom, small-town Louisiana. Practice, constitutional law teaching at a minor Louisiana college. With all due respect, your understanding of constitutional law is pedestrian. Perhaps if you spent less time with your Bible and more time with actual legal scholarship, you'd understand the complexities of congressional oversight and the unprecedented nature of the threat we faced. Several Democrats chuckled. A few reporters typed furiously, already composing tweets about Raskin's devastating put-down. Johnson sat quietly, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He hadn't opened his briefcase yet. His expression remained neutral, almost serene. When the rules finally gave him time to respond, he didn't immediately take it. He let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable, just long enough for Raskin's smirk to grow wider. Then Johnson spoke, his Louisiana accent soft, but his words carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet chamber. Professor Raskin, I appreciate your concern for my education. Perhaps I should clarify my credentials. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. He continued without notes, without hesitation, reciting the entire Article 1 of the Constitution from memory. Section 2 on House composition. Section 3 on Senate structure. Section 4 on elections. Section 5 on congressional procedures. Section 6 on compensation and privileges. Section 7 on the legislative process. Section 8 on enumerated powers. All 17 clauses. Section 9 on limitations. Section 10 on restrictions on states. 3 minutes of word-perfect constitutional recitation. The chamber had gone completely silent. Reporters stopped typing. Democrats stopped smiling. Raskin's face had frozen in an expression somewhere between shock and calculation. Johnson finished Section 10 and looked up mildly. "That's from memory, Professor. I've read it a few times." He reached for his briefcase with unhurried deliberation and opened it with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. One by one, he removed 8 manila folders and arranged them on the desk in front of him in a precise line. Each label faced the cameras perfectly large enough to read on screen. "Now then," Johnson said, his voice maintaining that same quiet calm, "since you questioned my constitutional understanding, perhaps we should examine yours." "Professor, you taught constitutional law at American University." "For how many years?" 23 years, Raskin answered, his voice less certain now. 23 years, Johnson repeated. He pulled a document from beneath the folders. "This is your law review article from 2015. The tyranny of legislative overreach when Congress exceeds its constitutional authority. Excellent piece. Very thorough on the importance of separation of powers, due process and limitations on congressional investigative authority." Johnson opened the article and began reading. "Congress must remember that investigation is not persecution, that oversight is not overreach, and that the power to investigate does not include the power to destroy those being investigated. The Star Chamber is a relic of English tyranny, precisely because it operated without the procedural safeguards that define justice." He looked up at Raskin. "Your words, Professor, from when you believed in constitutional limits, before you chaired a committee that violated every principle in your own scholarship." Raskin shifted in his chair. His lead attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but Raskin waved him off. "The January 6th committee operated within all constitutional parameters." Raskin stated, his professorial tone firmly back in place. "We had clear precedent for our investigative authority established procedures." "Precedent," Johnson interrupted softly. "Let's discuss precedent. In every previous congressional investigation of this magnitude, Watergate, Iran-Contra, even Clinton impeachment, the minority party received equal subpoena power. Your committee? The threat was unprecedented." Raskin began. "The minority received 0 subpoena power," Johnson continued, as if Raskin hadn't spoken. "In every previous investigation, the accused received due process rights, the ability to confront witnesses, access to exculpatory evidence. Your committee?" He paused, letting the question hang. "Witnesses deposed in secret, transcripts hidden, exculpatory evidence destroyed. And we're going to examine every single violation, Professor, because, unlike your committee, I believe in something you seem to have forgotten during your crusade. I believe in the Constitution. You spent 23 years teaching before you decided political expediency mattered more than constitutional principle." Johnson placed his hand on his Bible briefly, then moved it to rest on his pocket Constitution. The gesture was not theatrical, but natural, habitual. Proverbs 26:27 says, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it." Professor Raskin, you spent 2 years digging. Today we see how deep the hole goes. The hearing room had transformed in 15 minutes. What began as Raskin's confident performance had become something else entirely. The media section was typing different stories now. The Democrat side of the committee looked less bored, more concerned. Raskin's 5 lawyers were huddled in urgent conversation, and Mike Johnson sat quietly, his 8 folders arranged in front of him like evidence exhibits in a trial, his weathered Bible and pocket Constitution, flanking them like bookends of faith and law. "Shall we begin with the destroyed evidence?" Professor Johnson asked. His voice remained soft, almost gentle, because that's where your constitutional vandalism started. Mike Johnson opened the first folder with the careful precision of someone handling evidence in a criminal trial, which, in a sense, he was. Professor Raskin federal law is very clear on the preservation of congressional records. Title 44 of the United States Code. Section 2017 requires the preservation of records having historical or other value. Would you agree that records from an investigation into what you repeatedly called the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War would qualify as having historical value? Raskin nodded carefully. Of course, which is why we maintained extensive. Then, perhaps you can explain. Johnson interrupted his soft voice, somehow cutting through Raskin's response. Why the January 6th committee destroyed 23 hard drives containing witness interview materials one day before this Congress was sworn in and new subpoena powers activated. The room went silent. Raskin's expression flickered between surprise and calculation. "I'm not aware of any destroyed." Johnson pulled out a thick document and held it up to the cameras. "This is a signed receipt from Iron Mountain Secure Shredding dated January 2nd, 2023. It lists 23 hard drives delivered for physical destruction. The authorization signature is right here." He pointed to a signature line on the document, then displayed it more clearly. Even from the gallery, people could read the name Jamie Raskin. "That's not I would need to examine the context." "The context," Johnson said, reaching into the folder for another document, "is that these hard drives contained 847 witness interview transcripts that were never provided to the subjects of your investigation, never turned over to defendants in criminal trials, and never made available to this new Congress. The context is that these interviews contained exculpatory evidence. The context is 18 U.S. Code Section 1519. Whoever knowingly destroys documents with the intent to obstruct investigation shall be fined or imprisoned up to 20 years. Johnson's voice remained level, but his words landed like hammer blows. He pulled out a timeline chart and had it displayed on the hearing room screens. January 1st, 2023, our new Congress is elected. January 2nd, you authorized destruction of evidence. January 3rd, new subpoena powers would activate. The timing is remarkable, don't you think? Professor, one of Raskin's attorneys, leaned forward, trying to interject, but Johnson had moved on to specific examples. Let me tell you about some of what was on those destroyed hard drives. Capitol Police Captain Stephen Braun testified in a classified session. Yes, Professor, we obtained the backup files your IT staff didn't know existed, that his officers were ordered to remove barricades and allow protesters to approach the Capitol. His testimony directly contradicted the violent breach narrative. That interview was destroyed. Johnson displayed a recovered file on the screens showing the transcript header with Braun's name and testimony date. Former FBI Assistant Director Timothy Chambers testified that he personally informed your committee that the pipe bombs found at the DNC and RNC had been planted the night before January 6th and were deliberately crude, likely a distraction. He testified that the FBI had surveillance footage identifying the planter, but chose not to pursue prosecution. That interview was destroyed. Each revelation hit harder. The media section was in chaos. Now reporters calling their editors updating their stories in real time. National Guard Commander William Walker testified that President Trump personally authorized deployment at 11:00 a.m. on January 6th, 3 hours before the breach. He testified that his authorization was blocked by the House Sergeant-at-Arms on orders from someone in congressional leadership. That interview was destroyed. Johnson paused, letting that sink in. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of moral authority. But perhaps the most damning destroyed evidence concerns a young man named Marcus Whitfield. He's 24 years old, from Michigan. He walked through open doors at the Capitol, stayed inside for 11 minutes, touched nothing, broke nothing, hurt no one. Capitol Police footage, which you also tried to destroy, shows officers waving him inside. He's currently serving a 4-year sentence in federal prison. Johnson produced a photograph of a clean-cut young man in military uniform. Marcus is a veteran professor, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He believed he had permission to be there because police literally waved him in. Your destroyed evidence included testimony from 3 officers confirming they were ordered to allow peaceful entry. That evidence would have freed him. The silence in the room was suffocating. Several Democrats looked visibly uncomfortable. Even some of Raskin's attorneys were exchanging troubled glances. How many people are in prison, Professor? Because you destroyed evidence that would have exonerated them. How many lives have been destroyed because you valued narrative over truth? Raskin finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier confidence. This is a gross mischaracterization. Any documents that were destroyed were duplicative or immaterial. Immaterial, Johnson repeated quietly. He pressed a button on a small recording device. A voice filled the chamber. Young female clearly stressed, Jamie, the Braun testimony is a problem. If defense attorneys get access to it, it undermines the whole violent insurrection frame. Can we just lose it? Another voice, unmistakably, Raskin's. Sarah, classify it at the highest level. If it stays classified, nobody sees it. If this Congress forces declassification, we'll have time to prepare a response. But back up. Copies need to go. Make it happen. The room erupted. Republicans shouted for order. Democrats demanded to know the source. Media phones came out. Raskin had gone pale. That recording, Johnson said calmly over the chaos, was made by a member of your committee staff, Sarah Chen. She's testifying to the FBI under immunity right now. She has 17 hours of similar recordings. She came forward because, in her words, I went to law school to pursue justice, not to help destroy it. Johnson closed the destroyed evidence folder and looked directly at Raskin. 18 U.S. Code, Section 1519. Professor, destruction of evidence to obstruct justice. You taught this statute. You know the penalties. And you did it anyway, because the truth, the actual truth, didn't serve your political narrative. He let the words settle, then reached for the second folder. But destroying evidence was just your opening act. Let's talk about how you manufactured the evidence you didn't destroy. Let's talk about witness tampering. Johnson opened the second folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Before he could speak, Raskin tried to regain control. Mr. Chairman, these allegations are inflammatory and unsubstantiated. I motioned to Professor Raskin. Johnson interrupted, his soft voice somehow more commanding than Raskin's bluster. You're not the chairman anymore. You're the witness. And unlike your committee, we let witnesses finish speaking. The rebuke was delivered without malice, which somehow made it more devastating. Johnson turned to a specific page in his stack. Let's talk about Cassidy Hutchinson, your star witness, the testimony that made national headlines. Do you recall her appearance? Of course, Ms. Hutchinson bravely came forward. Ms. Hutchinson received 137 text messages from your staff before her public testimony, Johnson stated. We have all of them. They were subpoenaed from her carrier, not from her phone, so she couldn't delete them. He displayed several on the screen, the timestamps and content clearly visible. Remember, you felt threatened by the president's behavior. Use the word scared. The detail about the steering wheel is crucial. Don't back down on that, even if asked for clarification. Your legal fees are covered, as long as you stick to the statement we prepared. Each text bore the number of different January 6th committee staff members. Several showed Raskin's personal cell phone number. That's not witness preparation. That's witness coaching, Johnson said. The difference is whether you're helping someone remember the truth or helping them remember your version. These texts show the latter. Raskin's lead attorney was furiously writing notes, occasionally whispering to Raskin, who was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. But Ms. Hutchinson isn't the only coached witness, Johnson continued. He pulled out another document. Mark Robinson was a former White House deputy assistant. He testified in closed session that he saw President Trump angrily demanding to go to the Capitol. You leaked that testimony selectively. What you didn't leak was that when questioned in detail, Mr. Robinson admitted he didn't actually witness this personally. He heard it secondhand from someone who heard it from someone else. Johnson displayed Robinson's full deposition with the relevant sections highlighted. In legal terms, that's triple hearsay, inadmissible in any court, but you presented it as eyewitness testimony in your report. He moved to another example, his pace, methodical and devastating. Capitol Police Sergeant Harry Dunn testified publicly about racist slurs he heard during the riot. Powerful testimony. But here's his original deposition from August 2021. Johnson showed the relevant pages. In his original testimony, Sergeant Dunn said he didn't hear racial slurs personally, but was told about them by other officers. By his public testimony, 6 months later, the story had evolved into first-person experience. What happened in between? He pulled out phone records, 43 phone calls from your staff to Sergeant Dunn. Email exchanges discussing messaging strategy. A consultant from your communications team visiting him 5 times. Johnson looked up from the documents. You didn't just coach him on testimony. Professor, you changed his testimony. And he's not alone. The next revelation hit even harder. Johnson pressed play on another audio recording. This one clearly from a phone call. Male voice anxious. I don't feel comfortable exaggerating what I saw. What I witnessed was concerning, but not what you're describing. Raskin's voice, cold and calculating. Mr. Palmer, you need to understand something. We're on the side of truth here. The president attempted a coup. If you can't see that, if you won't help us demonstrate that, then perhaps the FBI needs to look more closely at your own actions that day. I understand you entered the Capitol building yourself. The male voice, now frightened. I was evacuating with everyone else. Raskin's voice. Were you, or were you participating? That's a question of interpretation. Help us with the truth about Trump and your own actions. Don't need interpretation. Do we understand each other? The silence that followed was broken by gasps from the gallery. This wasn't just witness coaching. This was witness intimidation. Blackmail. That phone call, Johnson said into the stunned silence, was recorded by Officer Joshua Palmer without your knowledge. He came forward last month. He's testifying later today via video link because he's terrified of retaliation. Raskin tried to speak, but his voice cracked. His attorney put a hand on his arm, but Raskin shook it off. "That's taken out of context." "Context?" Johnson said, and pressed another button. The screens lit up with a new video feed. A middle-aged man in a police uniform appeared sitting in what looked like a law office conference room. "State your name for the record," an off-screen voice prompted. "Joshua Palmer, Capitol Police Officer, 15 years of service." "Officer Palmer, you were contacted by the January 6th committee." "Yes, sir. Multiple times." "Tell us what happened." Palmer took a breath, visibly nervous, even via video. "I was told my testimony was needed about what I witnessed on January 6th. I agreed to testify truthfully, but when I gave my statement to committee staff, they weren't happy. They said my description of events didn't match their understanding. They wanted me to emphasize certain things, downplay others. Specifically, they wanted me to say I felt my life was in danger, that the crowd seemed coordinated, that it felt like an insurrection. But honestly, it felt like a protest that got out of hand. Chaotic? Yes. Dangerous in moments? Yes. But not what they were describing." "What happened when you said that?" Palmer's face showed genuine fear. "I got a call from Congressman Raskin personally. He threatened me. Said if I wasn't going to help establish the truth about Trump's coup, maybe the FBI should investigate why I let protesters into the building. I didn't let anyone in. I was responding to the emergency. But he made it clear that my testimony would be interpreted however he wanted, unless I cooperated." "Did you cooperate?" Palmer's voice broke. "I changed my testimony. I'm ashamed of that. But I have a family, a pension at stake. I was scared." The video paused. Johnson turned back to Raskin, whose face had gone from pale to red. 18 U.S. Code Section 1512, Johnson said quietly. "Witness tampering. Threatening a witness to influence testimony. Maximum penalty, 20 years federal prison." He closed the witness tampering folder but didn't move to the next one yet. "How many witnesses did you threaten, Professor? How many testimonies did you manufacture? How many people lied under oath because you made them more afraid of you than of perjury charges?" Johnson's voice remained soft, but his words carried the weight of moral judgment. "You taught legal ethics, Professor. You know that witness tampering doesn't just corrupt a single trial, it corrupts the entire justice system. When people can't testify truthfully without fear, justice dies." He paused, then delivered the final blow of this chapter. "Officer Palmer isn't testifying alone today. We have 4 other witnesses, 3 Capitol Police officers and 1 White House staffer, all prepared to testify that they were threatened, coached, or intimidated by your committee. All have corroborating recordings, text messages, or emails. All have been granted immunity to testify truthfully now about how you forced them to lie." Then Raskin's lead attorney stood abruptly. "Mr. Chairman, I need to consult with my client. I request a 15-minute recess." Johnson looked at the committee chairman, who nodded. 15 minutes. As Raskin and his legal team huddled in urgent, heated conversation. The hearing room buzzed with activity. Media members rushed to file updates. Republican committee members looked grimly satisfied. Democrats looked shaken. Mike Johnson sat quietly at his table, his remaining 6 folders still unopened. He placed his hand briefly on his Bible, his lips moving in what might have been a silent prayer. When the hearing reconvened 14 minutes later, Raskin's legal team had shrunk from 5 attorneys to 4. One had quietly excused himself, citing conflicts that have emerged during testimony. The rats were beginning to abandon the ship, and there were still 6 folders to go. The hearing reconvened in an atmosphere of palpable tension. Raskin's remaining attorneys sat closer to him now, forming a protective barrier. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the careful, defensive posture of someone who knew worse was coming. Johnson opened the third folder without preamble. "Professor Raskin, you're familiar with Brady versus Maryland?" "Of course," Raskin answered, his voice clipped. "Prosecutors must disclose exculpatory evidence to the defense. And while the January 6th committee wasn't technically a prosecution, you repeatedly stated that you were building a case and providing evidence for criminal referrals. Would you agree that the spirit of Brady should apply? In principle, transparency is important. But, in principle," Johnson repeated, "let's test that principle against your actions." He pulled out a document whose header was clearly visible on the screens. National Guard Timeline Classified. January 6, 2021, 10:00 a.m. President Trump meets with Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller. Subject: authorization for National Guard deployment to Capitol if requested. This meeting is documented in the White House visitor logs, Pentagon records, and Miller's sworn testimony. Johnson displayed each piece of evidence methodically. 11:03 a.m. President Trump signs written authorization for up to 20,000 National Guard troops to be deployed to the Capitol complex at the request of Capitol Police or congressional leadership. This authorization is transmitted to the Pentagon Capitol Police Board and House and Senate Sergeant at Arms offices. He showed the authorization document, Trump's signature clearly visible. 2:24 p.m. Capitol breach begins. National Guard has not been deployed. Why not? Professor Raskin shifted uncomfortably. The President's delayed response. The President authorized deployment 3 hours before the breach. Johnson interrupted firmly. What delayed the deployment was rejection of that authorization by congressional leadership, specifically by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He displayed email exchanges with timestamps. 11:47 a.m. House Sergeant at Arms. Paul Irving emails Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund. Speaker and Senate Majority Leader have denied National Guard authorization. They prefer optics of no military presence unless absolutely necessary. The hearing room erupted. Republicans shouted for order. Democrats demanded source verification. Media phones captured every word. That email, Johnson continued over the noise, was in the documents your committee received from Capitol Police. It was classified at your request and never included in your final report. President Trump gave authorization. Congressional Democrats blocked deployment. You hid that evidence and blamed Trump for the delay. Raskin's attorney was pulling on his sleeve, but Raskin pulled away, his face flushed with anger. Those emails are classified for national security reasons. They were classified, Johnson corrected, to protect political narratives, not national security. President Trump declassified them his last day in office. You kept them buried anyway. Johnson moved to his next piece of hidden evidence. Let's talk about Ray Epps. Your committee mentioned him briefly, then dropped all investigation. The man captured on video the night before January 6th shouting, "We need to go into the Capitol." The man filmed directing people toward the building during the breach. The man who, despite being filmed committing what your committee called insurrection, was never arrested, never charged, never called to testify publicly. He displayed a series of video clips showing Epps engaging in exactly the behavior described. Your committee interviewed Mr. Epps twice in private. Those transcripts were classified. Why, Professor? What did Mr. Epps tell you that couldn't be made public? Raskin's jaw tightened. Mr. Epps was determined not to be a central figure. Mr. Epps, Johnson interrupted, pulling out a heavily redacted document. Told your committee in his second interview that he had been in communication with FBI field agents in the weeks before January 6th. That's in his transcript, line 847, which you classified. He stated he was asked to monitor militia group activities and report back. That's line 852. Johnson looked up from the document. Ray Epps was working with the FBI. He was arguably the most visible instigator on video, and he was working with federal law enforcement. That evidence would have raised serious questions about FBI involvement and foreknowledge. So you buried it. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Democrats were frantically conferring. Republicans sat in stunned silence. Even those who had suspected such things, Johnson wasn't finished. He pulled out another set of documents. The pipe bombs found at the RNC and DNC headquarters on January 6th. Your committee presented them as part of the coordinated attack, evidence of planning and malice. Let me read from your final report. The placement of explosive devices demonstrates premeditation and coordination in the attack on our democracy. He set down the report and picked up an FBI file. Here's what you didn't include. FBI Technical Analysis Report dated January 15, 2021. Devices examined show evidence of intentional mechanical deficiencies, rendering them unlikely to detonate successfully. Kitchen timer mechanisms set incorrectly. Powder composition insufficient for explosive force. Assessment. Devices designed to be discovered, not to explode. Johnson let that sink in. The pipe bombs were fakes, sophisticated enough to look real on camera, deficient enough that they couldn't actually explode. They were a distraction placed the night before. Captured on surveillance cameras by someone who knew exactly where those cameras were positioned. He displayed surveillance stills showing a hooded figure placing the devices, each image showing them walking in camera view rather than avoiding it. Your committee had this analysis. You had FBI surveillance footage clear enough to identify the individual. They had specific physical markers, a distinctive gait pattern, even a partial vehicle registration, but you never pursued it publicly. Why? Raskin's remaining attorneys were in open argument with him now, voices rising in heated whispers. Let me propose a theory, Johnson continued. You didn't pursue it because the answer led somewhere your narrative couldn't follow because it raised questions about provocation and infiltration that would undermine the spontaneous insurrection story you needed to tell. Johnson closed that section and moved to perhaps his most damaging revelation. Finally, let's discuss the timeline your committee presented to the American people versus the timeline documented by multiple independent sources. He displayed a large chart showing two parallel timelines. Your committee claimed President Trump watched the riot unfold for 187 minutes before calling for protesters to leave. Your entire narrative centers on this claim that he deliberately delayed intervention. Johnson pointed to his chart. Here's what actually happened. Documented by phone logs, video timestamps, and witness statements, you didn't destroy. 1:12 p.m. Trump's speech ends at the Ellipse, a mile away from Capitol. Travel time to Capitol 15 to 20 minutes by foot. 1:30 p.m. First barriers are breached at Capitol. Trump is still at the Ellipse meeting with organizers. 1:49 p.m. Trump returns to White House. Pentagon logs show he calls Acting Secretary Miller to confirm National Guard authorization still stands. 2:24 p.m. Capitol building breached. Trump immediately calls multiple senators asking about safety. 2:38 p.m. Trump tweets, "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. Stay peaceful." 3:13 p.m. Trump tweets, "No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order." 4:17 p.m. Trump releases video statement. I know your pain, but you have to go home now. We have to have peace." Johnson looked up from the timeline. That's not 187 minutes of silence. That's constant communication within the limits of what a president can do when congressional leadership has rejected National Guard deployment and Capitol Police have lost command control. He pulled out one more document, handling it with particular care. But here's the evidence that destroys your entire timeline narrative. At 2:25 p.m., 1 minute after the Capitol was breached, Trump was on a recorded line with Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. The transcript. McCarthy: "They're breaking into my office. You need to call this off." Trump: "Kevin, I already authorized the Guard this morning. Why haven't they been deployed?" McCarthy: "What? I was told you were blocking deployment." Trump: "That's a lie. I signed authorization hours ago. Call Miller at Defense. He'll confirm." Johnson set down the transcript. "That phone call, Professor, was in the records your committee subpoenaed from phone carriers. You never mentioned it in your report. You never called McCarthy to testify about it publicly, because it demolished your entire timeline theory. The silence in the hearing room was absolute. Every Democrat on the committee knew the implications if Trump had authorized the Guard early and congressional leadership had blocked it. If Trump had made the calls and tweets that the committee timeline omitted. If the committee had systematically hidden every piece of exculpatory evidence that contradicted their predetermined narrative. "Brady versus Maryland," Johnson said softly. "The prosecution must disclose evidence that might exonerate the defendant. You weren't legally bound by Brady, Professor, because you weren't a court. But you claimed to be pursuing truth. You claimed to be following evidence wherever it led. Those claims were lies." He closed the exculpatory evidence folder and looked directly at Raskin. "You hid evidence that would have changed the entire national conversation, evidence that would have prevented criminal charges, evidence that would have altered the political landscape. You didn't pursue justice, Professor. You pursued a predetermined conclusion and buried anything that contradicted it." Johnson's voice, still soft, now carried unmistakable moral authority. "That's not investigation. That's persecution. And it's the reason why Romans 12:19 says, 'Vengeance is mine, says the Lord.' Because when humans decide to pursue vengeance instead of justice, this is what happens. Truth becomes optional. Evidence becomes political. And innocent people suffer." He reached for the fourth folder, then paused. "But perhaps the most disturbing part of your investigation wasn't what you hid from the public. It was what you sold to the public. Let's talk about your media manipulation." Johnson opened the fourth folder with the deliberate care that had become his signature in this hearing. By now, even the most partisan Democrats in the room had stopped their whispered conversations to watch. The folder labeled Media Coordination seemed to generate its own gravity. "Professor Raskin, you appeared on cable news 847 times during your committee's operation. That's more than twice per day for the committee's entire existence. Impressive availability for someone conducting such an important investigation." Raskin, visibly tired, now attempted to reclaim some authority. "The American people here deserve to be informed." "Informed?" Johnson repeated. "Interesting word choice. Let's examine how you informed them." He pulled out a thick stack of emails and began displaying them on the screens. Email dated March 15, 2022 from your personal account to Jake Tapper at CNN. Your Jake, tomorrow's hearing will focus on Proud Boys coordination. I'll be available for your show at 9:00 p.m. Attached are the 3 key points I need you to hit in the setup. Make sure to frame it as stunning new evidence of conspiracy. Johnson showed the attached talking points, which matched almost word for word what Tapper's show aired the next night. Email dated June 3, 2022 to Rachel Maddow at MSNBC. Rachel, we're releasing the Hutchinson testimony next week. Embargo the details I'm sending now, but prepare a 30-minute segment. I've drafted the narrative arc that will be most impactful. Let's connect to coordinate your questions. The media section had gone very quiet. Several journalists were visibly uncomfortable. Email dated August 19, 2022 to multiple reporters at New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico. Team, tomorrow's hearing will be our last before fall break. We need maximum impact. I'm attaching transcripts with the sections highlighted that you should emphasize. Note that other sections of these transcripts are contradictory. Please focus only on highlighted portions. Full context muddies the message. Johnson looked up from the emails. You weren't informing the media, Professor. You were directing them, writing their narratives, editing their coverage. You turned journalism into a PR arm of your committee. He pulled out financial records that made the journalists in the room shift uncomfortably. But it wasn't just about controlling the narrative. It was about profiting from it. Johnson displayed a contract. December 2021. While your committee investigation was beginning, you signed a $4.7 million book deal with Random House to write about the January 6th investigation. The book was marketed before it was written based on the presumption that your committee would produce criminal evidence against Trump. He showed the book's promotional materials, which promised the inside story of how Congress brought a former president to justice. Professor, didn't this massive financial incentive, nearly $5 million, create a conflict of interest in how you conducted your investigation? If your committee found ambiguous evidence, or worse, exculpatory evidence, wouldn't that hurt your book sales? Raskin's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His attorneys were frantically writing notes, but their body language spoke of resignation rather than strategy. The book released in November 2023. Johnson continued. It hit number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Early sales exceeded 500,000 copies. At your royalty rate, you personally earned approximately $2.8 million in the first 6 months. He sat down the financial documents and picked up the book itself, holding it up for the cameras. I read your book, Professor, cover to cover. It's very well written, very persuasive. It also contains 17 claims that are directly contradicted by evidence your own committee collected, evidence you hid from the public. Johnson opened to marked pages and began reading. The president refused to authorize National Guard deployment despite desperate pleas. That's page 147. We now know he authorized it hours before the breach. He flipped to another marked page. No evidence suggests FBI involvement or advanced knowledge. That's page 203. We now know Ray Epps was communicating with FBI agents. Another page. All witness testimony was voluntary and uncoerced. That's page 89. We've now heard from witnesses you threatened. Johnson closed the book and set it down with deliberate finality. You wrote a best-selling book based on false information you knew was false because you'd hidden the evidence that would disprove it. That's not journalism. That's not even propaganda. That's fraud. He pulled out more documents, these showing wire transfers and payment records. But the book deal wasn't your only media profit. Speaking fees, $850,000 from various organizations during and after your committee work. Paid contributor contract with MSNBC, signed in December 2023, immediately after your committee dissolved, $500,000 annual salary. Consulting arrangement with documentary filmmaker Alex Holder, $250,000 plus back-end percentage. Johnson displayed each contract, each payment, building a financial picture of systematic profiteering. You earned over $4 million from the January 6th investigation while conducting the January 6th investigation. Every cable appearance was a commercial for your book. Every hearing was a promotional event. Every bombshell revelation was a sales opportunity. He paused, letting the financial evidence speak for itself, then moved to perhaps the most damaging aspect of the media coordination. But the most troubling coordination wasn't about what you told the media. It was about what you gave them before your own committee members had seen it. Johnson displayed a series of timestamps. June 27, 2022, 6:30 p.m. Your committee receives Cassidy Hutchinson's full deposition transcript, including all the contradictions and qualifications she made. June 27, 2022, 8:15 p.m. You email full transcript to 4 reporters. June 28, 2022, 7 a.m. Washington Post runs story with selective quotes from Hutchinson, omitting all contradictions. June 28, 22, 9:30 a.m. Your committee convenes to review Hutchinson transcript. Republican members seeing it for first time. Media has already reported selective version. Johnson looked up from the timeline. You gave media the evidence before your own Republican committee members could review it. You coordinated selective leaks to shape the narrative before any deliberation could occur. That's not transparency, Professor. That's tactical media manipulation. He pulled out one more document. This one stamped with official seals. House Ethics Committee reviewed your media coordination at my request. Their report released this morning finds systematic violations of House rules regarding confidential committee information, apparent conflicts of interest regarding commercial exploitation of committee work, and patterns of selective information released designed to prejudice public opinion. Johnson set down the ethics report and picked up his Bible briefly, as if drawing strength from it. Proverbs 11:3 says, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity." Professor, you didn't guide anyone to truth. You used duplicity to build a media empire and a financial windfall. He closed the media coordination folder and reached for the next one. His voice remained calm, but carried an edge of building anger. But as troubling as personal profit is, your next scandal is even worse. Because you didn't just enrich yourself. You built a family enrichment scheme that exploited the very tragedy you claim to be investigating. And for that, Professor, there is no excuse. The hearing room had grown heavier with each revelation, but Johnson's voice as he opened the 5th folder carried a new note. Not just legal condemnation, but moral disgust. Professor Raskin, I want to be clear about something before we proceed. I'm deeply sorry for the loss of your son, Tommy, in 2010. No parent should endure that pain. Your family's grief is real, and no political disagreement changes that. The moment of compassion was genuine, Johnson's face reflecting real sympathy. But then his expression hardened, which makes what I'm about to expose even more unconscionable because you used your family's grief and the nation's tragedy to build a multi-million-dollar enrichment scheme. He pulled out incorporation documents. January 15, 2021, 9 days after the Capitol riot, your son-in-law, Jamin Raskin, files paperwork establishing the January 6th Truth and Justice Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Listed purpose: providing support to victims and families affected by the January 6th insurrection. Johnson displayed the founding documents on the screens. The Foundation's board, your son-in-law as executive director, your daughter Tabitha as operations director, your wife Sarah as chairman. It's a family business, Professor. A grief exploitation business. He pulled out fundraising materials showing emotional appeals with photos of the Capitol riot, wounded police officers, and traumatized staff. The foundation raised $23.4 million in its first 18 months of operation. $23 million from Americans who wanted to help January 6th victims. That's genuine charitable impulse from donors who trusted that their money would reach hurting people. Johnson's voice grew harder. Here's where their money actually went. He displayed a financial audit, the numbers highlighted in red. Administrative expenses, $17.8 million. Program expenses, $3.1 million. Fundraising expenses, $2.5 million. That means 76% of donated funds went to administration, 11% to fundraising, and only 13% to actual victim support. The room stirred with angry murmurs. Even Democrats looked disturbed. Let's examine those administrative expenses. Johnson continued pulling out detailed breakdowns. Executive director's salary, your son-in-law, $485,000 annually. Operations director, your daughter, $380,000. Chairman consulting fees, your wife, $500,000. Combined family compensation, $1.365 million per year from a charity supposedly helping victims. He displayed photographic evidence that made the exploitation visceral. This is your son-in-law's Instagram from August 2022. The image showed a young man standing next to a Porsche 911. Caption, "New ride, new chapter. #blessed." This is your daughter's Facebook from December 2022. A photo of a luxury vacation, tropical beach, crystal clear water. Caption, "Thankful for the ability to heal in paradise." Your wife's public disclosure forms show a new vacation home in Aspen purchased in March 2023. Value, $3.2 million. Johnson sat down the photos. Meanwhile, here's Maria Stevens. She was a Capitol police officer on January 6th. Suffered PTSD, can't work full-time anymore. She applied to your family's foundation for assistance with counseling costs. Application denied. Reason given, limited resources must be prioritized. He showed more victim stories, each one more heartbreaking. Brian Kowalski, maintenance worker at the Capitol, denied. Richard Hayes, House staff member, denied. Melissa Traub, Senate aide, denied. Johnson's voice rose slightly. Your family denied actual January 6th victims while paying themselves over $1 million per year, while your son-in-law bought Porsches, while your daughter vacationed in paradise, while your wife bought a ski chalet. He pulled out correspondence between the foundation and rejected applicants. Here's an email from Maria Stevens to your daughter. Please, I just need help with therapy costs. I can't sleep. I can't work. You advertise this foundation as helping people like me. Your daughter's response, we receive many worthy applications. Unfortunately, we cannot help everyone. Johnson looked up his eyes hard. But you could help yourselves generously while actual victims suffered. The ugliness of the scheme was becoming overwhelming. Republicans looked furious. Democrats looked sick. The IRS is now investigating the foundation, Johnson continued. Preliminary findings show massive diversion of charitable funds to insider compensation. That's charity fraud, Professor. He displayed the IRS notice of investigation. But there's more. Your committee work and your family's foundation weren't just parallel. They were coordinated. Johnson showed email exchanges. June 2022, your committee's public hearings are generating massive media coverage. Your daughter emails various committee staffers, can you provide email lists of people who've contacted the committee expressing support for our fundraising outreach. He showed response emails providing exactly those lists. Your committee staff gave your family foundation access to constituent contact information to solicit donations. That's conversion of official resources to private profit. Johnson pulled out bank records. Your foundation paid $750,000 to Media Consulting Services, LLC for strategic communications. That company is owned by a former aide of yours. Its actual service, coordinating foundation fundraising appeals with your committee's hearing schedule. He displayed side-by-side timelines showing hearing dates perfectly aligned with fundraising spikes. June 28th, Hutchinson testimony. June 29th, Foundation sends mass email. Donations that day, $1.2 million. July 21st, hearing on Trump's inaction. July 22nd, Foundation email. Donations, $890,000. The pattern was undeniable and sickening. Johnson pulled out a sworn affidavit from Alicia Martinez, a former grant coordinator for the foundation. He began reading. I was told to approve minimal applications and to prioritize high-profile victims who could provide good testimonials for fundraising. I saw that sustainability meant enriching the Raskin family, not helping victims. Johnson set down the affidavit. You took the nation's horror, your family's grief, and real victims' suffering, and you turned it into a cash cow. James 2:7 says, Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. You didn't look after victims in distress, Professor. You exploited their distress for profit. Johnson closed the folder. But as morally repugnant as financial exploitation is, your greatest crime wasn't against donors or victims. It was against the Constitution itself. He reached for the folder labeled Constitutional Violations. Let's talk about how you destroyed the very document you claim to have spent your life studying. Johnson opened the 6th folder. He placed his pocket Constitution next to it. Professor Raskin, in 1986, you wrote your senior thesis at Harvard. Page 34. The greatest threat to liberty comes not from obvious tyranny, but from well-intentioned officials who believe their noble purposes justify abandoning constitutional constraints. Your words, Professor, before power corrupted your principles. Article 1, establishing Congress's powers. Nowhere does the Constitution grant Congress the power to operate as prosecutor, judge, and jury combined. Your committee obliterated those boundaries. He documented the violations. Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Your committee subpoenaed hundreds, deposed them in secret, and made criminal referrals without due process protections. Sixth Amendment. The right to be confronted with witnesses. You made referrals based on secret testimony from witnesses the accused never met. That's a star chamber, Professor. Fourth Amendment. Protection against unreasonable searches. You subpoenaed phone records and bank records without probable cause warrants. He showed court rulings from 2023 where a federal judge ruled 73 of your subpoenas unconstitutional. Johnson moved to Article 1, Section 3. Impeachment trials are conducted by the Senate with the Chief Justice presiding. You conducted what was effectively a third impeachment trial without any constitutional requirements. He showed his own constitutional law textbook. Chapter 7, page 193, when congressional investigations morph into trials, Congress has abandoned its constitutional role and embraced tyranny. You wrote that, Professor. Then you violated every principle in it. He closed the folder. You became a domestic enemy of the Constitution, not through violence, but through something more insidious, claiming to defend it while demolishing its protections. He read Matthew chapter 7:3. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye. But we're not finished. Your constitutional violations were part of a coordinated cover-up. You knew your methods were illegal, and you conspired to hide it all. He reached for the folder labeled Cover-Up Conspiracy. Raskin sat diminished, sweat-soaked. Only 2 of his 5 lawyers remained. Mike Johnson opened the 7th folder. Professor Raskin, 18 U.S. Code Section 1519, knowingly destroying documents to impede investigation. You authorized document destruction. The question is whether you knew you were obstructing justice. He pulled out internal communications. December 15, 2022. Email from Chief Investigator Marcus Brennan. We have significant material that contradicts our public statements. Recommend immediate strategy session on document retention policies. December 16, 2022. Internal memo. Attendees agreed that certain materials could be classified at higher levels or deemed duplicative. Priority materials. National Guard timeline, FBI confidential human source reports, Capitol Police stand-down orders. You held a meeting specifically to identify evidence that contradicted your narrative and to hide or destroy it, Johnson stated. December 20th, 2022. Text from you to Kristen O'Brien. The hard drives need to go before the new Congress is sworn in. Can't risk them being subpoenaed. O'Brien's response, Jamie, I'm not comfortable with this. This feels like obstruction. Johnson showed the FBI notice of investigation. This morning, the FBI confirmed it has issued grand jury subpoenas for your personal communications. You are under federal criminal investigation for obstruction, conspiracy, and witness tampering. The FBI has been monitoring your communications under a sealed warrant since January 2023. Another of Raskin's attorneys stood up. Mr. Chairman, I have an ethical obligation that prevents me from continuing representation in light of this revelation. He packed his bags and left. Your lawyer is abandoning you, Johnson observed. You're criminally guilty. Johnson reached for his final folder, Criminal Referrals. He turned to the cameras. What you've witnessed today isn't political theater. It's documentation of the most serious constitutional crisis since Watergate. A member of Congress used his position to manufacture evidence, destroy contrary evidence, and obstruct justice. He turned back to Raskin. Professor, you betrayed the public trust for money, for fame, for partisan victory. He began reading the referrals. 18 U.S. Code 1519, destruction of evidence, 23 counts. Max 20 years per count. 18 U.S. Code 1512, witness tampering, 17 counts. Max 20 years per count. 18 U.S. Code 1001, false statements to Congress, 34 counts. Max 5 years per count. 18 U.S. Code 371, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., 8 counts. Max 5 years per count. 18 U.S. Code 201, bribery, 11 counts. Max 10 years per count. 26 U.S. Code 7206, charity fraud, 7 counts. Max 3 years per count. That's 93 federal charges, Professor. A Democratic Congresswoman from California stood up. I'm Jennifer Polson. I've served with Congressman Raskin, but I cannot and will not defend what we've heard today. Jamie, I believed we were pursuing truth, but you pursued a narrative and profited from tragedy. I can't be complicit anymore. She walked out, followed by 2 other Democrats. Johnson delivered his final words. Proverbs 26:27. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. You dug a pit for President Trump and January 6th defendants. Today, you've fallen into your own pit. He moved for the committee to recommend criminal investigation. revocation of security clearances, and a special counsel. Every Republican voted yes. 3 Democratic hands joined them, then more. The motion passed with bipartisan support. As Raskin was helped toward the exit, Johnson called out, "That Bible you mocked earlier, it's not just a book I hide behind. It's the foundation of the justice you're about to face." Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. 3 months later, federal agents arrested Raskin. The indictment was 47 federal charges. His foundation was dissolved, its $4.2 million in assets seized for victims. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The jury found him guilty on 39 of 47 counts. Raskin was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He would be 73 when released. The accountability cascade continued. 12 other committee members faced ethics investigations. Media figures who amplified leaks faced their own reckoning. Marcus Whitfield's conviction was overturned. Hidden Capitol Police footage led to 47 case reviews and 17 convictions being vacated. In Louisiana, Mike Johnson said, "I didn't take down anyone. I just presented evidence." Truth becomes necessary precisely for emergencies. The minute we think our purposes justify abandoning constitutional principles, we become the threat. Years later, the hearing was a masterclass in law schools. In federal prison, Raskin read constitutional treatises in the library. Mike Johnson added a plaque to his office with words from Madison's Federalist 51. "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Raskin forgot the second part. Mike Johnson remembered it.